you all so much for coming. I know you're all super busy, so really thank you for making time. And so a little bit about how I came across this topic and the motivation within my own life. So growing up, I was very lucky to be surrounded by a ton of really inspirational Muslim woman role models. And that was great, but I saw that there was definitely a contrast between the women I saw in my life and many of the Muslim women portrayed in the media, as a lot of those were like portrayed as victims of oppression and didn't have much agency to control their own narratives. And so that's kind of how the topic, that's what really fascinated me about Princess Fawzia when I first delved into her life and her story. And so a little bit about the outline of my talk today. So first we'll look at the quick history of the Egyptian monarchy, Princess Fawzia's life, and then looking at how does that fit into a greater narrative around women in the Middle East. And then a little bit about how I did my research and the thesis itself, and then a couple of next steps that I'm hoping to share with you all. So a little bit about the Egyptian monarchy. So obviously it started with Muhammad Ali, and after a number of generations, Princess Fawzia was born, and she was the sister of King Farouk, who later became the last king of Egypt. And so Princess Fawzia was born in 1921, and in 1939, after growing up with a British governess in Alexandria, she moved to Iran, where she got married to Mohammad Pahlavi, who was the crown prince of Iran at the time. And then in 1948, 10 years later, after giving birth to her daughter, Princess Shanaz, Princess Fawzia actually got divorced from the Shah of Iran and moved back to Egypt. And in 1949, she got remarried to Shireen Bey, who was a high-ranking official in the Egyptian government, who was pretty close to King Farouk. And in 1952, when the Egyptian monarchy got overthrown, Princess Fawzia was the only one within the close circle of the Egyptian monarchy to be allowed to stay in Egypt because she was married to an Egyptian. And so she actually lived in Cairo all the way until 2013, where she died the day before the military coup on President Morsi. So she lived through much of modern Egypt and a number of different structural changes within the Egyptian government. And so Princess Fawzia's life is especially interesting because while she was not representative of all Egyptian women at the time, she definitely kind of is a great lens into the lives of Egyptian women, since through her life we can see how there was a paradox between the national media and the international media portrayal of her life. And so even though she played a really big role in national society, much of international media portrayed her as being a victim of oppression. So a little bit on where I did my research. I was lucky enough this past summer to conduct research at Harvard Library, the Oxford University St. Anthony's Middle East Center Archive, the KEW National Archive in the UK, and then the Cairo Library and the AUC American University in Cairo Rare Books Library. And so the first place I visited was the Oxford University Middle East Center Archive at St. Anthony's College. And this was a wonderful experience as I got to flip through Bruno Salvini, who was an Italian photographer's wedding album of Princess Fawzia and Mohammad Pahlavi's marriage. And so this was fascinating to look through, not only because it documented much of the wedding celebrations, but also because while I flipped through these pages, I saw what the Crown Prince did on his visit to Egypt. And so, as you can see here, he went to a women's tennis tournament, he got to see some fencing, he went to the National Opera, and so documented a lot of like the cultural monuments at the time. And then at the British National Archive at the Kew, there were a number of letters that weren't quite about Princess Fawzia, but related to the British and Egyptian international affairs at the time. And so I got to read like handwritten letters by Sir Miles Lampson, who was the British ambassador to Egypt at the time, to Sir Anthony Eden, who was the foreign minister and later became the prime minister. And so it was fascinating to read these letters because obviously they didn't talk a lot about Princess Fawzia, but they talked a lot about the relationship between British and Egypt, and much of the way that the British officials referred to King Farouk was that he was a baby in need of babysitting, and it was like very derogatory. And then I got to visit a number of different places in Egypt, which kind of gave me a sense of what Cairo looked at the time of Princess Fawzia's life. And so I also got to go to the mosque where the Shah of Iran actually ended up being buried. So after he was overthrown by the Islamic Revolution, and nobody would take him in and he died of cancer, President Sadat agreed to take him in. And it's interesting because he's buried alongside a number of other Egyptian royals. And then I got to go to the Cairo Library, which was quite an experience because unfortunately, while they had a ton of different resources, none of it was indexed, a lot of it wasn't kept very well, and as you can see, much of the material was kind of falling apart. And so this was kind of difficult since while there was a lot of material stored here, it was really hard to navigate, unfortunately. On the other hand, when I went to the American University Rare Books Library, it was a great experience because there was a lot of information that was relevant to Princess Fawzia, and it was really great to be able to see all of this. And so over here you can see an album by Dr. King Farouk, who kind of documented many of the royal protocols after the 1952 revolution. And so it was a great way to kind of document and elaborate all of that. And then over here you can also see a number of covers that Princess Fawzia was on, especially in Al-Musawwir, which was an Egyptian women's magazine at the time. And so going through going through all these magazines and seeing Princess Fawzia was really cool, but also seeing all the different women that showed up was really interesting as well, because Princess Fawzia was definitely not the only woman to show up. But what women were doing at the time was obviously fascinating because a lot of us wouldn't think back at this in the 1940s in Egypt and picture all of these. And so, so for the for the international media, a lot of my sources were Princess Fawzia was documented in sources like the New York Times. She got coverage in the Times of India, in much smaller newspapers like the Philadelphia Inquirer, and so she kind of spanned a lot of international media in some parts of her life. And then in national media, I used most of my sources I got from the American University in Cairo, and those were like Al-Musawwir, Al-Ahram, and so that was great. And so, so the first example of how Princess Fawzia really had a paradox within the media coverage on the international media and on the national level is through her wedding. So Princess Fawzia really became international and appeared in international media in her wedding to the Crown Prince of Iran in 1939. And I have a quick video that will kind of demonstrate what I'm talking about.
A wedding without a bride. Such is the custom in Egypt. So when the Iranian crown prince arrives from his wedding to the beautiful Egyptian Princess Fawzia, he does not set eyes on her until after the marriage contract has been signed by the King of Egypt, her brother. Now they are together for the first time on their wedding day. A mighty procession representing the public services of Egypt is organized in honor of the royal wedding. And this is witnessed by the newlyweds to the great delight of the populace. Their beloved little princess has married her Prince Charming, so Cairo honors the occasion in fitting style.
So obviously this wedding was a really big moment for the international scope of things because it was a marriage between a Sunni princess and a Shia prince, and it was seen to bring together two very strong Muslim empires at the time. However, given that this marriage was a political one, it was a political one for both Crown Prince Mohammed Pahlavi and Princess Fawzia. So it was not more political for one or the other, and almost everybody recognized that she got as much say in it as he did, and so there wasn't really like a power struggle there. However, much of international media, as you can see in the video, kind of referred to Princess Fawzia really sarcastically, like she wasn't even there for the marriage ceremony, and a lot of it was like derogatory in the sense that she wasn't even present. And this kind of was reflected not just in some videos, but in like lots of the international media sites all over. For example, in like the 3-page New York Times editorial that was about this wedding, most of the details about Princess Fawzia mentioned what she was wearing, all the presents she had gotten, rather than talking about like her education, even though they talked a lot about Mohammed Pahlavi's education. Again, during her time in Iran, the media was very dismissive towards Princess Fawzia. So she did an interview with the same photographer that photographed the English royal monarchy. And what was really interesting about that one was that she ended up being on the cover of Life magazine and had a number of pages dedicated to her inside Life magazine. But all the images were of her looking really sad and desolate. And in fact, some of the imagery was that she was like standing in front of a cage with doves inside it, and that was kind of meant to reflect that she had little say in her life and was kind of like trapped inside this political affair. And so that was really interesting. And what was really sad about this was because Fawzia had now become representative of Iranian and Egyptian women, and through that kind of more Middle Eastern women as well. And so, yet the international media didn't change their portrayal of her at all once she became representative of so many people. And then when she got divorced to the Shah of Iran, again, there was kind of a paradox between the way that the media represented her and the way that the reality was playing out. And so the governments of Iran and Egypt came up with the excuse that Princess Fawzia was moving back to Egypt because she couldn't deal with the climate in Iran and felt very depressed there. And while part of this was certainly true, much of the international media completely tore this reasoning apart, and many people attributed her divorce to the fact that she had bore the Shah of Iran no sons. What was interesting, though, is that later, when Princess Ashraf, the twin sister of the Shah of Iran, wrote her memoir, she said that the real reason behind their divorce was that Princess Fawzia was really unhappy in Iran. Yet in Fawzia's 2013 obituary, still all the news sites reported that the reason for their divorce was her lack of son. And then her second wedding to Shireen Bey also demonstrated this same paradox. So without all the pomp and ceremony of the earlier marriage, Princess Fawzia wasn't that interesting to international media. And so while like newspapers like the New York Times had reported on her for 3 or 4 pages, this time they gave her, and they afforded her, only a small paragraph because it just wasn't as interesting anymore. And in the end, that kind of demonstrates how, again, she was just like a dress that walks without any brains or substance to her life. However, as Princess Fawzia kind of disappeared from the international level, she became a national icon. And she did so in a number of ways. So the first way she did that was that she used political initiatives to galvanize Egypt's women. And so during the 1948 Palestinian-Israeli and Egyptian War, you can see Princess Fawzia here on the cover of Al-Musawwir, dressed as a first nurse. And what's really interesting about this cover is that there's all the imagery kind of demonstrates how she was pushing for women to be involved in serving their country, but at the same time staying true to some of like the more feminine roots of Egyptian women. That was definitely like one really interesting paradox to see. And then through that, she kind of helped galvanize more women. And so here you can see in some of the subsequent al-Musawwirs, a number of women pilots starting to get involved in the war effort. And the next month of al-Musawwir actually featured a woman nurse who had kind of become inspired by Princess Fawzia. So that was really interesting and awesome to see. And then again, she and her sisters actually visited a number of military hospitals to visit veterans and publicize their visits in order to raise awareness about this war that Egypt was fighting. And another way that she became involved in national politics was by using health initiatives to support women and children. And so very quickly, Princess Fawzia realized when she moved back to Egypt in 1948 that many women and children in some of the more rural governorates of Egypt did not have access to health care or any health services. And so her goal was to open a health clinic for women and children in each of the governorates in Egypt. Unfortunately, she and the Egyptian monarchy were overthrown in 1952 before she reached that goal, but she started a number in a few governorates. And again, she was the head of Mubarak Muhammad Ali, so the Muhammad Ali charity. And through that, she led a number of charity events where she raised money for this charity and used it to help women and children in Egypt. And finally, Princess Fawzia also attended a number of conferences for women at a time when a lot of Western women weren't even doing so. And so this is like really interesting because over here you can see her and Princess Shah of Egypt and Turkey. She was the last Turkish princess and married into the Egyptian monarchy at the Women's Conference in Egypt. And then over here you can see her at another conference. So one of the big questions that's really interesting, obviously, is what does Fawzia's life tell us about Egypt's women in general? And so here I have kind of a contrast between the 1919 Egyptian Revolution and the 2011 Arab Spring. And you can see that for the past, basically 100 years, women have played a really important part in Egypt's politics. Yet, in 20th century Egypt, women in general were not reported on fairly in international media. For example, over here you can see women and boys compared at every level of education, so from kindergarten all the way to collegiate. And at every single level, women were outperforming men, which is really interesting. Yet on the international level, again, this was not reflected at all, as it was usually the men who were praised for all their achievements. And then women were also driving, etc. And then today, this kind of leaves us with the question is how are Muslim women, beyond even Egyptian and Middle Eastern women, being portrayed in international media, and does that fairly portray what they have been doing in each of their communities? And so this question has kind of been really important to me and kind of feels into like some of my next steps. I'm hoping to continue my work with this project. And so one idea I had is creating a deck of tarot cards featuring historical Muslim women or modern Muslim women as a way to redefine the narrative around women in general. And then as well, there's a lot of, there's increasingly number of platforms that are advocating for Muslim women and helping them redefine their own narratives. And so getting involved with that and kind of talking about Princess Fawzia as a way to help us understand how the media functions today is really interesting. And then personally, some of my next steps include creating an exhibit about Princess Fawzia at the American University Rare Books Library, and also submitting a paper to the Concord Review. Thank you so much for coming.